Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. At Oxford High School in October 1936, Winston Churchill unveiled a plaque to former pupil and dear friend T.E. Lawrence. His tribute included, "Lawrence was one of those beings whose pace of life was faster and more intense than what is normal. Just as an aeroplane only flies by its speed and pressure against the air, so he flew best and easiest in the hurricane. He was not in complete harmony with the normal. He was indeed a dweller upon the mountain tops where the air is cold, crisp and rarefied, and where the view on clear days commands all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them." Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. Look, I have to tell you, I've been dying to do a podcast on T. Lawrence for a very long time. The man was such an enigma, and I can't wait to share what I've discovered. Seven Pillars of Wisdom, his book, was published in 1935. I actually have a first edition of it sitting in front of me, and it immediately became a bestseller, outselling the Bible. It was incredibly popular, and of course, at this stage, Lawrence was incredibly famous. One of my favorite films of all time is Lawrence of Arabia, no surprise. And of course, it was played by the great, very pretty Peter O'Toole. In fact, I just watched it last week, and if you haven't seen it, you absolutely must. The story, the cinematography, the music, it's one of those films for a rainy afternoon that will actually change the way the world looks, if just for that moment in time. Of course, Lawrence was a lot shorter than Peter O'Toole. He was actually only about 5'3". And of course, we know that because there are several medical records where we get that information from. But very much like Peter O'Toole, he was this creature with a shock of very blonde hair, and he had piercing blue eyes, mesmerizing eyes. But who was Lawrence of Arabia? And keep in mind that he wasn't always Lawrence of Arabia. He was actually born in Wales, so I suppose he would have been called Lawrence of Tramadocht. And then he became Lawrence of Oxford, which was where he was brought up. And of course, his name wasn't Lawrence for a start. He didn't discover this as a fact until after the war. But he had a sense, and he's one of 5 children of 4 other brothers. But he's the only one who has a sense that there's something strange about his parents' relationship. And what's strange about it is that they're not actually called Lawrence. His parents aren't actually married. And at the beginning of the 20th century, this is actually quite a big thing. It's a big deal. So his father was actually an Irish baronet by the name of Chapman, who ran off with the governess, and he got her pregnant and then did the indecent thing at the time of leaving his wife and daughters. But his wife, of course, was Catholic, and she wouldn't divorce him. So he and the governess live in sin. But he does have money, though. However, he's left the estate and most of the fortune to his wife, but he's got enough never to have to work again. So he kind of lives a very comfortable middle-class life, as though he was a lawyer or something like that, and they move around a lot. So Lawrence's elder brother was born in Dublin, and Lawrence is the second one. He's born in Wales. And the third one is born in Normandy or Brittany. And the next one is born in the Channel Islands. And the next one is born in the New Forest. And then when it's school time, they decide to move to Oxford. And I think they move there because there they feel that they can live anonymously. There's no social life. There's no family. There's no family backstory. There's no we Lawrences come from wherever it is. But after the war, the old man Lawrence dies of the Spanish flu. So it must have been about 1919, and leaves this heartbreaking letter that says, "Oh, my sons, if only I had known there would never be a divorce. I've lived with this secret all my life, and this awful, awful weight." And they only find out after he dies, when he leaves this letter to be opened after his death, what the truth actually is. But with this sort of unusual background, and, Lawrence actually doesn't know how unusual it is, he's the only one of these 5 kids who actually feels that there's something weird about his parents, and it literally weighs on him. So he's convinced that his mother is his mother, but his father is not. and that this man has actually stepped in to do the decent thing by his mother, to protect this woman. And he has an incredibly complex relationship with his mother, who, of all the kids, she actually beats him quite savagely at times, and she punishes him a lot. And also, he's literally the runt of the litter. He's the second of five, but he's small, and the others are actually not small. But he's also incredibly clever too. He's very bright, and he's very dedicated to building up this way. He also loves going on long walks, and when he gets a bicycle, he loves going on long bike rides. And by long, I mean he actually cycles from Oxford down to the south of France and back. I mean, that's long. And then crucially, he decides to go and see the Crusader castles. He does this in his second year at Oxford, where he's actually studying medieval history. And he decides to go and have a look at the origin of some of the various elements of Crusader castles. He becomes obsessed. He's fascinated with matulation, which is the bit that actually hangs above the gate of a castle, where you can actually pour the boiling oil down onto people who are trying to, batter or take the castle. I mean, it's a very niche thing, and you have to say that he's a bit of an oddball. On the first year that his summer holiday ends, so his first year at Oxford, he's actually cycled the entire way around France looking at these castles. And then in the second summer, he decides to walk around the Middle East, as you do. And he actually writes a book about Crusader castles, which becomes his thesis, for which he actually receives a first. And of course, at this stage, he's being acknowledged as quite a bright spark. He's a bit of a brain. But he's even a bit stranger than that. He's also, as a kid, he's collecting shards of pots and bits of broken glass that they're digging up from the roads in Oxford. They were doing a lot of construction at this time. When he was growing up, and he actually pays the workmen with his pocket money to give him whatever little bits and pieces they dig up. And what he ends up doing is reconstructing medieval pots and Elizabethan bottles and things. And then he becomes the youngest ever donor to the Ashmolean Museum. And then he helps them, the Ashmolean Museum guys, reorder all their medieval collection. And keep in mind, he's only 16. I mean, he was a complete nerd. And I think there's something rather lovely about all of this. And interestingly, and I think crucially, he, of the five kids, is the one who tells them stories at night, when they're little. And the stories that he tells are always about Arthurian legends. The stories of knights doing really noble things, of saving young ladies, of storming castles. He's deeply romantic in a sense. He has this romantic soul, but he's completely not a romantic person. That's just not the kind of person that he is. He's a loner at this point. He's actually doing something interesting. He's looking at these meticulations in 1908, and then what happens? Well, he's got a relationship with the Ashmolean, and the Ashmolean is going to be an incredible pivot point in his life. It's transformative. And there is a man there called Hogarth, D.G. Hogarth, who is such a shady character in a nice way. He had been an archaeologist and then a journalist. He didn't have any money. He didn't inherit money, so he had to make it. And he was a very popular public speaker. And of course, then he became the director of the Ashmolean in Oxford. And he sort of becomes Lawrence's surrogate father and looks after him. So he helps him into Oxford University because he knew him beforehand. And he suggests that he might go and look at Crusader castles in France. And then he arranges and helps him arrange, the big walk that Lawrence makes around the Middle East in his second year. Now, I say that he's shady, and what I mean by that is I think he might be a feeder for spooks. So one of the guys who actually recruits intelligence agents, and the like. And I think he's a spook of some sort for sure. And I think it was also about him that Churchill famously said, "It was unhealthy for so much power to be in the hands of one man whom nobody understood his origins or his trajectory." And of course, he's a friend of everybody. I mean, he's the director of a museum and he's an archaeologist. He's this interesting guy. And of course, he's the pinnacle of respectability. But behind that, he appears to have been doing all sorts of shady things. And I actually spent a lot of time trying to find information about him. And the Ashmolean told me that they had nothing on him whatsoever. They say that the files that they had been weeded, which means that someone had actually gone to the trouble of going through them and cleaning them out. But I did find out that somebody some years earlier had actually done a PhD on him. And I tracked that person down who said, I've left academia. And it was as though her PhD on Hogarth had actually ended her life. And she was actually working in a bar in outback Australia, a bar that in the middle of nowhere. And she made me promise not to reveal where she was. But anyway, I found her, and she actually said that the Ashmolean did have a copy of her PhD. And they swore to me that they didn't. But I did eventually get it. And what I found out was that Hogarth ends up running the Arab Bureau in Cairo during the First World War. So let's surmise that Lawrence has been recruited into the equivalent of MI6, and he's then sent out to walk around the Ottoman Empire. In 1908 or 1909, probably 1909 by the time he gets to Beirut, the Ottoman Levant, like the rest of the Ottoman Empire, is in a state of flux because the Young Turks in 1908 had taken power, but they had sort of a power-sharing agreement effectively with the Ottoman Sultan. But in 1909, they actually literally depose of the Sultan. And this has resulted in a real sort of turmoil in the region. And everything that we're going to be talking about here in the Middle East, you know, what we now call the Middle East, which would be Anatolia and Palestine and Syria, and the whole way around into Egypt, is in a complete flux. So what is left of the Ottoman Empire at this time? Well, they still have some European provinces. There's still Bulgaria and Montenegro, and there's a little bit of Greece and Macedonia. And still, you know, the whole way down through Syria in what is now the Asian part of Syria and the Asian part of Turkey, and what is now Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. So they've got quite a lot. And Egypt is still nominally theirs. And of course, they pay tribute to the Ottomans. However, the British had invaded Egypt in 1882, so it's British occupied, and it's called a veiled protectorate because the British actually don't annex it. So it's still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire with the king, you know, the Khedive. And of course, Libya is still part of the Ottoman Empire too. So Lawrence is actually walking through what feels like an empire in decline. And I then wondered if he'd formed an opinion of what he thinks the Turks or the Ottoman Turks are actually like. And the answer in his letters and his journals is yes. He uses the word stupid a lot. He keeps on calling them stupid. He says these people do not understand how to run an empire. And he's watching, you know, the last grasp that they have on it. And while he's walking around, because, you know, the Sultan is gone, there's a sense with the minorities in the region, and most of the region is made up of these minorities, that this is their moment for independence. People like the Armenians and the Kurds, you know, all those kind of tribes. And of course, it's also the beginning of the Arab nationalist stuff as well. So there's a lot of tension, which is why he was told, A, not to walk, and B, not to walk alone. And of course, Lawrence being Lawrence completely ignores it all. So he's this little figure, this little blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure who goes off walking with a backpack and with a camera and a revolver and a single change of clothes. And this is actually how he, first of all, discovers the Arab culture. And he becomes very enamored by it all in a very Orientalist kind of way. And he has this romantic notion of what it is to be an Arab. You know, he literally knocks on people's doors saying, hey, you know, I'm here now, I need somewhere to sleep. Because most of the places where he walks, there are no hotels. So when you get to a village, there's this wonderful thing, and I think it still exists in the Middle East now, called Middle Eastern hospitality. You know, people will literally take you in and feed you and give you a bed for the night and then give you food the following day to go off with. And at this stage, it's very much a male thing. Unless, of course, you're Gertrude Bell. And actually, Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell's paths do actually cross a little bit later, and I'll talk very briefly about that. But Lawrence was doing this alone, and there were wild wolves at this stage roaming the deserts. And sometimes, when he comes to a village or an abandoned castle, he would just unroll his mat and sleep outside. I mean, it must have been absolutely amazing to be able to do that and not have to worry about anything apart from wild animals. And of course, he didn't speak the language. He had the very basics of Arabic, then got to learn that people would actually be interested in him. And of course, they were curious, asking where he was from. And of course, this then started, although he may have started with a limited vocabulary, pretty soon he was becoming fluent. Although I must say that by the time he got to Lebanon, he actually found that a lot of the people there spoke English because the Lebanese were always going off to earn money and bring money, from places like New York and London, which they still do now, of course. But the further he goes, the more Arabic he picks up. And of course, he had studied it a little bit before, but this trip really cements his skills. And in a way, he actually becomes a triple threat. And I don't know whether Hogarth sent him out with that in mind, but he's learning the terrain. He's making maps. He's making contacts, very good contacts with the local people. And of course, he's learning the language. And I then wondered if there was any awareness inside Lawrence, if this is what he was being groomed for, that he's being molded, into this super spy, which they'll call on in the future when needed. And I think something we have to be really careful about with Lawrence is that there's so much mythologizing, after the war ends, because he's one of its most famous survivors. And, very soon he's about to become the most famous, survivor. And therefore, everybody around him starts mythologizing and adding to the stories. And he actually does it himself by giving different accounts and then mythologizing about his own accounts. So he says later on, yes, I was preparing myself for this great work, but I actually don't believe it. I don't think he was. I always assumed that he was just into meticulations because they're actually wonderful things, these things on these Crusader castles. And I really don't think we have to make up this spy persona for Lawrence just because later on he actually ends up, during the First World War being this super spy and doing, incredibly, espionage type things. I honestly think that he was actually just a weird nerd who was not a team player, who wanted to be out there by himself. And all of these things kind of happened by happenstance. I think I'd read reports even when he was at school, they kept trying to get him to play team games, soccer and rugby. And he would literally just walk off halfway through them. He wasn't a team player. And of course, now he's going on these long, epic walks. So, there's no soles left on his sandals. He's had the most amazing adventure. And finally, he heads back to finish his degree and get his first at Oxford. And while he's there, he's actually given a fellowship at Magdalen College and given a grant to go and study medieval glass, somewhere in France. But then Hogarth gets a grant to go on an excavation to a site called Carchemish, which is one of the great sites of the Middle East. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. And of course, it's a Hittite site, and it's being dug by Leonard Woolley, who's now incredibly famous. And interestingly, the British Museum didn't actually want it. I saw this in some of the records that I was reading earlier on. The British Museum actually wanted a place called Hattusa, which is in the middle of Anatolia, in the middle of Asian Turkey, which was the Hittite capital. And the big thing about the Hittites at the time was nobody had actually translated their script. So everybody who was anybody was looking for, the equivalent to the Rosetta Stone, something that would actually have several lesser scripts that they would be able to translate from. And keep in mind that this is still the period when people are trying to find the archaeology of the Bible. And the Hittites actually appear in the Bible. So all of these people, in the early 20th century are trying to establish the truth behind the biblical narrative. And that's why they're doing it. So in the end, the Germans get Hattusa. German archaeologists get that site. And there's a real nationalism. There's a real nationalistic feeling with this. And even now, when you go to Berlin, you see all this stuff there in the Berlin Museum. that they took from this excavation way back then. And of course, the British get Carchemish, and it's actually a really important site because it sits on the Euphrates River. So, it's very important. And it was thought that because it was a frontier city of the Hittite Empire, maybe, just maybe, they would find something, a piece of stone, like the Rosetta Stone, with a bilingual or trilingual inscription on it that would actually allow them to decode the Hittite language. And it also happens to be right beside where the Germans are building the Berlin to Baghdad railway. There's competition among all the different European powers to woo the Ottomans. So the British are actually building them warships, the French are giving them loans, and the Germans are building a railway. And these are all different ways for these different European powers to position themselves, as seems likely, for when the Ottoman Empire actually disintegrates. And people have actually been waiting for this for about 200 years, but it hasn't happened, partially because the different European powers have all an interest in keeping it from the others. So, in order to avoid the Russians getting the Straits, all these different powers just keep the Ottomans intact. So we've got the Germans there, the British are there, sending guys like Lawrence out for long walks, surveying and the like. The French are also there, and they have their eye on Syria. And the Russians, obviously, who are concerned about who's going to be controlling the Turkish Empire when it eventually collapses. So this part of the world at this particular time is alive with spies, meeting in smoky rooms and drinking in places like Rick's Cafe in Casablanca. And within Istanbul, there's actually huge political unrest as well. And the Armenians are actually about to be fingered as traitors, to the empire. They're feeling very uncertain. And of course, to confuse matters even more, there's actually Armenian nationalists, two different kinds of Armenian nationalists competing with each other. So it's a fascinating time for Lawrence to be there, and he's learning a lot. So all these powers are there, present, intriguing, pretending they're not waiting for the whole thing to collapse, and preparing to walk in and take bits of the Ottoman Empire. And it also feels that there may be war on the horizon. So what's Lawrence doing at this time? Well, he's digging at Carchemish and falling in love with a young man by the name of Dahum. And Lawrence actually writes about him quite passionately, so I think he loved him. And in the winter of 1913, they're asked to go and look for the archaeological traces of Moses and the children of Israel, which even they know is ridiculous. And they're going with a couple of Royal Engineers, and they're going because Lord Kitchener, who has been a Royal Engineer himself, and at this point he's actually the ruler in British Egypt, he knows that there's one bit of the desert route between Palestine and Egypt and the Suez Canal, which is actually the route to India, and therefore absolutely central to the British power. There's one bit there that the Royal Engineers have never actually mapped. And so he has actually requested the Palestine Exploration Fund to ask for permission to send Lawrence and Dahum and Woolley to go and map this particular bit with a few Royal Engineers. And keep in mind, this is actually how espionage worked in Asia at this time. They were actually sending people up the Himalayas to map bits that might be useful. And what they were then doing was putting their findings into bottles and sending them down rivers. So, this kind of thing was happening, and the spooks down the other end of the river would pick these messages up. So to tell you a little bit more about Dahum, the man who stole Lawrence's heart, Lawrence actually met him in 1910. He's the poorest and the most junior of 200 locals working on the excavation at Carchemish. So this is the guy who brings out the water for the archaeologists and for the diggers to drink. But there's something about him, apart from his good looks, that actually inspires Lawrence. And I think it's partly that he's the only one of the 200, according to Lawrence, who's actually learned how to write any Arabic script. They're all illiterate. And so Lawrence says, well, with the money we're paying you, the British Museum was actually paying cash, and most of the work that these people did was barter. With this money, what are you going to do? And Dahum says, I'm going to get myself an education. So Lawrence says, fantastic, I'll educate you. And that's exactly what he does. And he's very specific. He doesn't want to give him a Western education. Lawrence actually hates all these kind of, half Westernized people. He wants him to be the best Arab that he can be, the best educated Arab that he can be. And many, many years later, Lawrence actually dedicates the 7 pillars of wisdom to him. And more than that, he actually says, everything I did for this person whom I cared about. And I think there's something quite beautiful about that. The other thing that I discovered in my research is that Lawrence is a man who actually doesn't like to be touched. And he was even weird about people shaking his hand. He just didn't like it. And of course, this all has to do with his mother. So he's with Dahum. He's living the best life in many ways. He's digging, he's sleeping under the stars. And as war approaches, there is absolutely no certainty which side the Ottomans are actually going to fall on. The French have actually lent the Ottomans a great deal of money, but it's one incident, and it's partly the responsibility of Churchill that shoves the Ottomans very forcibly into the war on the side of the Germans. And that's when these 2 warships that are being built in South Shields, a port that's in northern England, and the Ottoman state has actually borrowed a huge amount to have these ships built. They're going to be the pride of the new Ottoman Navy, and there's a massive campaign, I think, to raise money from the ordinary people to pay for these 2 new state-of-the-art battleships. They're very proud about the whole thing. And just at the wrong moment, Churchill, up to now, has been saying, no, we're not going to send the ships. They're not quite ready. They need a bit more polish. We need to get some more welders. We need to find some more welders. He's making up all sorts of excuses because war's on the horizon. And eventually he just says, no, we're going to impound them. And that impounding of those warships is what puts the Ottoman Empire into bed with the Russians. And about 1 week later, the Germans and the Ottomans sign a treaty, and the Ottomans enter the war opposed to the British. And of course, this is the beginning of World War I. So where's Lawrence? Well, Lawrence is in Oxford. He left Carchemish in June 1914, and he goes back to complete this map, Kitchener's map. So he's left everything there, but he's seen the empire, the Ottoman Empire, falling apart, and he's seen the Italians bombing Beirut harbor, and he's also seen, the Ottomans lose their European territories too. There was also talk of an Armenian and then a Kurdish uprising. And of course, there's all the talk about the Arab Congress and all this kind of stuff. He's seen all that. And yet he still doesn't understand that war is coming. He leaves everything in Carchemish thinking that he will just be able to go back and get his stuff, including things like his revolver. And later on, he says, quote, imagine I got shot by my own revolver. How uncomfortable would that be? So war has broken out. Lawrence didn't see it coming. So what is the response of Britain, and where do they deploy Lawrence? What do they want him to do? So Lawrence, like all young men of his generation, wants to sign up immediately. And everyone is saying, you can't. Don't do it. You can't. Hogarth is actually saying, don't, please wait. And so by the end of 1914, his brothers, his 2 elder brothers, have actually signed up heading to the Somme and certain death. They actually both die there. And Lawrence finally gets a position as a second lieutenant in the map room in Cairo. It's a really, really low position of someone of his intelligence. And of course, there is no evidence that he wasn't already part of the intelligence services. But this is the Arab Bureau, which has Hogarth at its head, which has all these archaeologists who have been in the area working for it, including Gertrude Bell, or Gertie Bell. And just very briefly, a bit of a segue. Gertie Bell was the daughter of an incredibly wealthy family. She had money behind her. She was a writer, she was a traveler, she was a political officer, she became an administrator, and of course, she was an archaeologist. And she spent much of her life exploring and mapping the Middle East. And she became highly influential to British imperial policy as an Arabist, actually, due to her knowledge and the contacts that she'd built up through her extensive travels. And she actually struck up an amazing friendship with Lawrence. And the two would actually trade letters, in the following years. And both Bell and Lawrence had attended Oxford. She'd attended some 15 years earlier, and they'd both earned first-class honors degrees in modern history, and both spoke fluent Arabic. And of course, both had traveled extensively in the Arabian desert and established amazing ties with the local tribes. She also wrote extraordinarily good books, and she was very fascinated, by the archaeology of the Middle East. So at this moment in time in Cairo, you've got all these guys who have learnt Arabic and Turkish, and they're not soldiers, they're archaeologists, and they're map makers, and they're something else. So this is now known as the Arab Intelligence Department. And there's actually an amazing picture of Gertie and Lawrence and Winston Churchill on camels, beside the pyramids just after the war. It's got everything in it. And there's a very good book about Gertie titled The Desert Queen by Janet Wallach, if anyone is interested in reading further about her story. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Okay, so they are this pool of characters, this pool of oddballs, and they're all kind of misfits. And they're there to try and work out, they have the Turks as enemies, to the north of Cairo. They have the Italians as enemies to the other side in the west, because the Italians have actually taken Libya at this stage. And they're there to basically work all this stuff out. And Lawrence is first of all sent to Iraq, to Kut, where there is a massive Indian force of Punjabis who have just landed. And through the stupidity of their superior officers, they've actually managed to get themselves surrounded. And Lawrence is actually sent there to try and negotiate with the local population, to try and get the Arabs there to rise up, because large numbers of the Indians are actually dying. And I think it's very weird that he's actually sent. He's a very junior officer with no brief, but he understands Arabs. He does. He gets them, and not many Brits do. But anyway, to cut a long story short, that's a complete failure, and he doesn't save the day. And you'd actually imagine that would be the end of his career. So he's back in Cairo having failed, and what he's then doing, because there isn't a great deal to do, he's making an incredible nuisance of himself. So he's the oddball who's quite keen on Arabs. And, you have all these other British chaps, kind of sitting there who find him very, unspeakable. And also Lawrence, he famously can't wear a uniform. He just can't get it together. He would turn up without his pips or without his jacket or whatever. And, his commanding officers, who thought this was actually an essential part of discipline, find him incredibly infuriating. And I don't think he does it on purpose. I just don't think that he sees the importance of the details in uniforms. Wearing a uniform is absolutely fine because it gives the impression of him being an officer, and that's fine, but he doesn't get the detail. And of course, the movie actually opens up with Lawrence in the map room not wearing a jacket and, having his tie undone, and then being taken from the map room and being offered a very special job. But in real life, that's actually not what takes place. The job that Lawrence is offered in the movie actually belongs to a guy called Sir Ronald Stores, who's an extraordinary man, and he definitely deserves a mention. And he's actually the Oriental attaché. I mean, he's massively overeducated. He's incredibly bright. He's ridiculously bright. He's one of these Brits who, walks around in linen suits with the sort of, sweat patches growing under his armpits and sweat running down his back. And he doesn't care. And of course, he's also a Cambridge man. And Lawrence said about him much later, And I quote, "The first of all of us was Ronald Storrs, Oriental Secretary for the Residency, the most brilliant Englishman in the Near East, and subtly efficient despite his diversion of energy in love of music and letters of scripture, of painting, or whatever was beautiful in the world's fruit. Storrs was always first and the great man among us." Storrs has been told he's going on a mission to talk to the Sheriff Hussein in Mecca, who was absolutely central to the whole Arab Revolt, if there's going to be one. And he is, alongside the Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan, the most important figure in the Muslim world, because the Sharif of Mecca is a direct descendant of the Prophet. Although there are actually lots of these around, it must be said, but he is actually the most important man at this moment in time. And Lawrence, because he's being such a nuisance in the Cairo bureau, and because there's nothing really that's intriguing him, actually asks permission to go along with Storrs. He's not being sent there. And of course, his superiors, who desperately want rid of him, agree immediately. Storrs actually famously doesn't talk to anybody because he thinks that everybody is beneath him. So he hardly speaks to anyone at all. He agrees to take him. So they leave in the summer, and it's a really, really sweaty journey down the Red Sea on this steamer. And they start talking to each other, and they actually become really good friends. And Storrs has an immense respect for Lawrence, and that also helps Lawrence standing. And also the fact that he actually speaks impeccable Arabic impresses the Sharif Hussein and his children. The idea that Storrs and Lawrence go there with is the same idea where they failed in Kut in Iraq. They're actually going there to stir the local Arabs up and to get them to support the British war effort. And I'm intrigued by this because it's in the British interest to have these tribes unite and cause a nuisance to the Ottomans. So that then made me think, does he do it because he believes in the United Arab Kingdom, or does he do it because he wants to help Britain? What's his motivation? Because he's very successful, isn't he, in talking to people and getting them to work together. That was actually his forte. And I came to the conclusion that it's both, actually. And I've got a quote for you. In March 1915, Lawrence wrote, "I want to pull them, the Arabs, all together and roll up Syria by way of Mecca in the name of the Sharif. We hope we can rush right up to Damascus and biff the French out of all hope of Syria." And that was in 1915, and he's a junior officer. And he also says at that time to Hogarth, who's his superior officer at the Arab Bureau, tell Winston, and you have to presume that's Winston Churchill, who is First Lord of the Admiralty at this point, that we need a landing in Alexandretta of Arabs who will then take what is, in his view, the Arab lands from the Ottomans and the Italians. And of course, what we now know is that Churchill chooses to go to Gallipoli, which is a complete disaster. And you know what? I bet Hogarth didn't tell Winston. Or if he did tell Winston, Winston would probably have said, "Who the hell is Lawrence? A second lieutenant, giving me ideas? Who is this man?" And I also have to say, though, that in retrospect, because I had a look at the maps, had Churchill taken his advice, from what we now know, it would have actually been a complete success. And it would have changed the face of the war there and then. It was a brilliant suggestion, and it would have actually saved the Armenians. But it didn't happen. So what did happen is that Lawrence goes to Arabia with Storrs. I was then wondering where Dahum was. Remember him? Lawrence actually dedicates 7 pillars of wisdom to him. Well, he's in Carchemish. Lawrence, on the other hand, supports Faisal as the up-and-coming man. And this is very, very important. He is one of Emir Hussein's sons. And Faisal is not the obvious one. He's not the eldest son, but Lawrence actually thinks that he's the one. Other people think this as well, because there's a solidity to him. There's this sense of measured judgment about him. And Lawrence thinks, and I think rightly so, that the others are rash and they're feckless and they don't have the weight that this man particularly has. I then wondered, how quickly does the idea of the attack of Aqaba appear after this? And this is really interesting because this is one of the most famous things that Lawrence is actually associated with. It's massive in the movie as well. And it's the capture of Aqaba which transforms the view of the Arabs as far as the British or as the Allies are concerned. And in Faisal's notebooks and in his letters and in his biography, it's insisted that Lawrence was at no point part of the negotiations of what they were about to do. And that is incredibly interesting because Lawrence absolutely claims it was his idea. So who's telling the truth? Well, we'll never actually know. So as far as the British were concerned, you have these Arabs and they have already declared a revolt. Very famously, there's the old man, the Sharif, who actually fires a rifle from the roof of his palace in Mecca. But nothing really much happens. But it's a massive symbolic thing. And so the British are thinking, we've got to fire this up and take this further. And just again to, contrast this with Kut in Iraq, the British worked very hard to get the local Arabs to rise up there against the Turks. And they thought that quite rightly that many of the Arabs would actually be very upset with the Turks and that they wouldn't feel any loyalty to the Turks. And of course, it was a complete failure in Iraq. But that's not the case now. When that rifle goes off and it's led by the Sharif of Mecca, it's completely different. And of course, the British have actually promised Arabs independence after the war. General McMahon, who is the commanding officer, has written letters to the Sharif promising them independence. Aqaba is incredibly important because up until then, the British had not considered the Arabs actually a viable force because they're so fragmented. They're there. And they have actually established their revolt, but bugger all is happening. You can't use them. They have no weight in this global war. And that's what the British are thinking. The point about Aqaba is that all the Turkish guns are famously facing out to sea because any attack on that port would have to come from the sea and not from the desert. I mean, who would be crazy enough to come through the blazing hot, scorching desert? And the British at this stage are a famous naval power. So that's why the guns are facing out to sea. And of course, the Arabs go through the desert, which is a hellish journey of some 40 days. And it's a very, very bleak, daunting journey even now. And they attack from behind, and it's this huge success. Except, of course, for Lawrence, who during the attack accidentally shoots his camel in the head and falls off just before they get there. And of course, it's not very heroic, is it? And you don't see that in the film. But what he has done, he's managed to persuade several tribes to come together for this attack, on the promise that there was going to be gold in Aqaba. Huge stores of gold. And if you remember in the movie, Anthony Quinn actually shouts, "Where's the gold?" But also, if you remember the movie, and this does happen, Lawrence is actually very keen for this to be known in Cairo, that the Arabs, a united Arab force, have actually taken Aqaba. So Lawrence makes this ridiculous journey by camel. I mean, in the movie, it's actually shown that he does it with one member of a tribe, but that's not actually true. In reality, there's like 4 or 5 of them. And in the movie, there's actually this amazing scene when they get to Cairo after spending God knows how long in the desert. They're parched and they're tired and they're dirty, and they walk into the officers' club. And Lawrence takes his Arab friends with him, of course. And these are men that he has fought with. These are Arab warriors. And he says to the Sabatan there, who serves the men, who serves the drinks to the officers, "Give these men drinks." And the response is, "I'm not serving them. They are bloody foreigners." And of course, that's all absolutely true. That happened. And there is a significance with this beyond the social side of it. And suddenly the British realize that something has to be done with these Arab fighters, that they now have merit, that there's now an importance to them. And of course, Lawrence is then encouraged to go back with a massive amount of gold, literally hundreds of millions of dollars, to pay the Arabs to fight on Britain's behalf. And this is where they start working behind enemy lines with Lawrence and blowing up Turkish trains and the like, disrupting communication lines. And it works. Lawrence realizes that you can't take on these great armies. You can't take them head on. It has to be done subversively. You could argue that the Arabs were fighting for independence, and it's an argument that has merit, but they were fighting for gold. Remember, Lawrence was paying them huge amounts to do this. Lawrence actually describes the armies that he's attacking like plants, that they're rooted. And what he says to the Arabs is that we can be like vapor. We can just waft in here and waft in there, which is effectively the beginning of guerrilla warfare. Isn't that brilliant? And that's exactly what they do, and they're incredibly successful. So they then decide that there's a large Turkish garrison in Medina, and they decide that they're not going to take it on because it's too big, but they're actually going to just cut it off. And this provides cover for the British, who are now moving up from Cairo, who are thinking about invading Palestine under General Allenby. But at this same time, as all this is going on, and as the Arabs are being promised independence and everything, two other people are being promised the same thing. And this is the duplicity of war and of the British. One is the Zionists are actually being promised a homeland in Palestine, which is under the Balfour Declaration. And the second one is that the French are being offered great chunks of the Middle East under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the same thing is being offered to these three groups. So, of course, the whole thing is going to blow up at some stage. It has to. And I don't think Lawrence actually knows that this is going on when he starts out. And I think he believes that it's just the Arabs who are in the running for their independence. And of course, when this comes out in 1917, the Guardian newspaper actually breaks this news. And they get hold of it because the Soviets pass it to them because they've just had the Russian Revolution. And Lawrence, at this point, whether he already knew it or not, writes a note to his commanding officer. And what he says is, I can't bear it. We have them fighting on a lie. I'm going off to get myself killed. And he literally disappears for over a week, and we don't know quite what happens. But this is exactly the same time as Daraa. It's around this period. And this is an absolutely appalling thing to happen to any human being. And just to remind everybody, Lawrence is this blonde, blue-eyed, and kind of smallish figure. And for whatever reason, he actually walks into the city of Daraa, which is being held by the Turks, and he's wearing Arab garb, but he's not hiding. And he's not wearing his uniform either. And it's unclear to them who he actually is, but they don't think he's Lawrence of Arabia because, at this stage, he's already famous. The Turks actually know of Lawrence. He's this enigmatic figure who's blowing up their railways and causing, all sorts of problems with their communication, but they don't recognize him as being that man. So they arrest him, but he's actually taken to a local commander who has him interrogated and beaten up, and he's in a pretty bad way. And then they clean him up and they give him a fresh set of clothes, and he's sent up under heavy guard to the commander's bedroom where he's raped repeatedly, and then given back to the guards who beat him up again, and then they throw him into the street. I'm actually very emotional about this because it's such a terrible thing to happen to anyone. Now, my feeling is that if they knew who he was, they would never have released him. And he later wrote of his capture, these are the words that he uses. He says that his integrity was defiled. But the question is, why was he there in the first place? And no one actually knows. The fact that he said he was going to get himself killed, well, he was obviously really struggling. Essentially also because, he'd got all these people, these tribes to trust him, to rise up. He'd brought them together to risk their lives. And he now knows that they're going to be shafted by the British. And he's absolutely caught up in the middle between these two sides because he desperately wants independence for the Arabs, but he also wants the British to win the war. And for a while, he could see these two things were going along very happily, but not now. At this point, he's realized that that's not going to happen. And after the war, he writes, it's a terrible thing to be caught between two cultures. And he then described it as a very Yahoo life. And then he says quite famously, never again will you be one thing or another. So just follow this through. So by now, lots of Indian troops have actually arrived in Egypt in very large numbers, including Rajasthani cavalry, regiments on camels. And they move up through Gaza and they fight a battle at Ashkelon and they take Palestine. But meanwhile, what is Lawrence doing? Well, Lawrence and his Arabs are moving up through the desert. So Allenby is actually moving up on the fertile land with the British Army and the Australians, and the Arabs are actually going up through the desert. So at this stage, Lawrence isn't known outside the arena of which he is operating. But there is one thing now that elevates Lawrence to Lawrence of Arabia, and that is his introduction to Lowell Thomas and his films. These are films that actually suddenly focus in on the white man dressed as an Arab. Thomas is actually an American with news cameras, and he's come to try and find stories that are going to keep the American public on side with the Americans entering into the First World War. And he's in Jerusalem when Allenby and Lawrence famously walked in, rather than ridden into this holy city to show their humility. And Allenby, who has a lot more in his mind, says, if you were looking for a story, then go with Lawrence. He's actually blowing up trains all over the bloody place. And so Thomas and his film crew are literally there filming while Lawrence and his Arabs are going down and blowing up these Turkish trains. And when these movies are shown back home, Lawrence becomes an absolute sensation. And of course, Lawrence later, describes himself, and I think rather dismissively, as just a matinee idol. I'm just a matinee idol now. But Thomas actually realizes that every time he shows this man on screen back home, that the audiences go absolutely wild. And so, of course, he actually becomes quite obsessed with Lawrence. And that's how Lawrence displaces everybody else and becomes Lawrence of Arabia. It's show business. The British say that this isn't actually a big thing for the war effort, but I think that with Lawrence, it really is a big thing. Aqaba would never have happened without Lawrence, and the Arabs would never have been kept on side without Lawrence. They are also Lawrence is actually the first into Damascus, and he kept the Arabs together. And he was the only one who understood how to keep them together. He understood the temperament of the Arabs, and no other British officer in his field did that or could do that. So Lawrence takes Damascus, but in the movie, the Arabs, you see them starting to fall apart. They can't agree with each other. There's a fire, there's arson in Damascus, and Lawrence also is exposed at this point as having been representative of this lie. The lie that the Arabs are going to get everything, but in fact, they're offered nothing. They've offered it to the French and to the Zionists. And it's just outside Damascus that Lawrence has also been given the news that Dahum has died. And he died of typhoid in 1916, but Lawrence doesn't hear about it until just before Damascus. And so everything that he's imagined, he's going to hand these new Arabs their states, and he'll be meeting up with Dahum, all of this kind of stuff. Everything that he's imagined has just fallen apart. And so he writes the very first night that he's in Damascus, as the faithful are being called to prayer, and there's a special prayer said for thanks for the salvation of Damascus, Lawrence writes, and so to everybody else, it was a great moment except for me. I knew everything was lost. And then he goes to Allenby and basically asks for permission to disappear. I mean, he's a colonel at this point. He's very senior. And he hands in his rank and he just wants to disappear. And that's what he does. You don't hear from Lawrence for about a year and a half. He's in shame. He feels that he's double-crossed his friends. I mean, he's figuratively a man now alone in his own desert. A few years later, in 1919, at the Cairo conference, he's re-emerged and he's there representing Faisal. Faisal isn't invited to this post-war carve-up, and Lawrence gets him in and then fails with that. And then later in 1922, when Churchill takes on the colonial office, he actually asks Lawrence to help him create a new order in the Middle East. And Lawrence then lays out his rules. I mean, can you imagine laying out these rules to Winston Churchill? And what he says is, we're going to have Arab kingdoms. And Churchill immediately agrees. And Lawrence then says, I'll do it for a year. After that, he then changes his name and he re-enlists as a private in the army. And he says he never wants any responsibility ever again because he knows he's failed. And he changes his name, He changes it twice, and he keeps on re-enlisting because the press keep on finding him. And so he's listed as a private soldier. But then what happens to him after the war? Well, he actually ends up in the northwest frontier in Pakistan, where he's translating Homer and the Odyssey, actually, which is actually rather appropriate, I think, for a man who's traveled as much as he has. But of course, the press finds him there as well. And, they're asking all these questions. What's Lawrence of Arabia doing on the northwest frontier? What he really wanted to do after the war was go back to archaeology, to go back to Carchemish. But of course, that's now being held by the French, and they won't allow it. They don't want Lawrence anywhere near any of their territories. So eventually in 1935, when he's coming to the end of his career, but of course, he's still a private. I mean, this is absolutely amazing. He's a private in the army, but he can still make one phone call and have dinner with Winston Churchill, the Lord of the Admiralty, and he can have dinner with the head of the Air Force. He can have dinner with the head of the army. These people are all his friends, along with George Bernard Shaw and E.M. Forster, the literary greats of the time. And by this stage, he's writing The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. It's not just a good book, it's a great book. But he hasn't published it yet, and it's not public knowledge because he doesn't want to. He knows what a fuss it's going to create. And of course, that causes a dilemma. And it must be said that when this book is eventually published, it was the biggest selling book of its time. It made an absolute fortune, and all the royalties went directly to the benevolent fund for widows of the armed forces. Lawrence kept absolutely nothing for himself. And then what happens is very tragic. He's finally happy, and he's living in a small cottage called Clouds Hill, which is his really lovely retreat. And he only really had two homes. He had a house that was built in Carchemish, which you can go and visit. They actually excavated it, but he actually built it from scratch. And there's this lovely cottage called Clouds Hill in Dorset, which is now in the hands of the National Trust. And it's wonderful because they've actually kept it exactly as it was on this day in 1935. And of course, he's still being hounded by the press, and all he wants to do is disappear. And he loved motorbikes. He loved going really fast. And he owned a Brough Superior. And he'd just been to London to see his friends, actually the editor of the Times and the Daily Mail, to try and persuade them to leave him alone. He just wanted to disappear. So he writes that morning, "I wonder what it's like to be a leaf falling from a tree." And there really is a sense of end about him. And later that day, he's going very fast on a Dorset lane, and he goes round the corner, and there are a couple of kids on push bikes, and he swerves out of the way, and he has a terrible motorbike accident. He's very badly injured, and he's in a coma for a few days, and then he dies, aged 47. And Churchill gives him this incredible keynote mention, which I read at the beginning of the podcast. But I would, however, like you to read what Churchill said in his memoirs about Lawrence, if I may, because I think it adds color to Lawrence and shows him in a bit of a different light after the war. "I did not meet Lawrence till after the First World War was over. It was the spring of 1919 when the peacemakers, or at any rate the treaty makers, were gathered in Paris, and all England was in the ferment of aftermath. So great had been the pressures in the war, so vast its scale, so dominating the great battles in France, that I had only been dimly conscious of the part played in Allenby's campaigns by the Arab Revolt in the desert. But now someone said to me, 'You ought to meet this wonderful young man. His exploits are epic.' So Lawrence came to luncheon. Usually at this time in London or Paris, he wore his Arab dress in order to identify himself with the interests of Faisal and with the Arabian claims then under harsh debate. On this occasion, however, he wore plain clothes and looked at first sight like one of the many clean-cut young officers who had gained high rank and distinction in the struggle. We were men only, and the conversation was general, but presently someone rather mischievously told the story of his behavior at an investiture some weeks before. The impression I received was that he had refused to accept the decorations which the king was about to confer on him at an official ceremony. I was Secretary of State for War, so I said at once that his conduct was most wrong, not fair to the king as a gentleman, and grossly disrespectful to him as a sovereign. Any man might, in refusing, state the reasons or principle which led to his action, but to choose the occasion when His Majesty, in pursuance of his constitutional duty, was actually about to perform the gracious act of personally investing him as the occasion for marking a political demonstration was monstrous. As he was my guest, I could not say more, but in my official position, I could not say less. It is only recently that I've learned the true facts. The refusal did, in fact, take place, but not at a public ceremony. The king received Lawrence in order to have a talk with him. At the same time, His Majesty thought it would be convenient to give him the commandership of the Bath and the Distinguished Service Order, to which he had already been gazetted. When the king was about to bestow the insignia, Lawrence begged that he might be allowed to refuse them. The king and Lawrence were alone at the time. I did not see Lawrence again for some weeks. It was, if my memory serves me right, in Paris. He wore his Arab robes, and the full magnificence of his countenance revealed itself. The gravity of his demeanor, the precision of his opinions, the range and quality of his conversation, all seemed enhanced to a remarkable degree by the splendid Arab headdress and garb. From amid the following draperies, his noble features, his perfectly chiseled lips and flashing eyes loaded with fire and comprehension shone forth. He looked what he was, one of nature's greatest princes. We got on much better this time, and I began to form that impression of his strength and quality which since has never left me. 7 Pillars of Wisdom ranks with the greatest books ever written in the English language. If Lawrence had never done anything except write this book as a mere work of the imagination, his fame would last. To quote Macaulay's hackneyed phrase, as long as the English language is spoken in any quarter of the globe, The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels are dear to British homes. Here is a tale originally their equal in interest and charm, but is fact, not fiction. The author was also the commander. Those who knew him best miss him most, but our country misses him most of all, and misses him most of all now. For this is a time when the greatest problems upon his thought and work had so long centered, problems of aerial defense, problems of our relations with the Arab peoples, fill an ever larger space in our affairs. For all his reiterated renunciations, I always felt that he was a man who held himself ready for a new call. While Lawrence lived, one always felt, I certainly felt it strongly, that some overpowering need would draw him from the modest path he chose to lead and set him once again in full action at the center of memorable events. It was not to be. The summons which reached him, and for which he was equally prepared, was of a different order. It came as he would have wished it, swift and sudden on the wings of speed. He had reached the last leap in his gallant course through life. Winston then wrote a very small poem to him. All is over, fleet career, dash of greyhound, slipping thongs, flight of falcon, bound of deer, mad of hoof, thunder in our rear, cold air rushing up our lungs, din of many tongues. King George V then wrote to Lawrence's brother, his name will live in history. That is true. It will live in English letters. It will live in the traditions of the Royal Air Force. It will live in the annals of war and in the legends of Arabia. Thank you for spending time with me, guys. Bye for now.